In How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, Chapter 1 discusses his parents' involvement and initial interest in the Black Power movement. Starting from a soul liberation concert that had guest Tom Skinner, an evangelist of the Black liberation theology, Kendi's parents, quote, were saved into Black liberation theology and joined the churchless church of the Black Power movement, unquote. But outside the scope of Kendi's parents, how did religion play a role in the Black Power movement of the 60s? To understand the role of religion in this movement, we must first take a step back to view this from a historical lens. Before we begin, I'd like to preface this by stating my own biases. I myself am not religious. I was raised in a Catholic church, but very quickly determined that that's not for me. So really my perspective from this is from the viewpoint of my just interests and how religion plays a role in these movements. Now let's continue. From 1526 to 1808, around 400,000 Africans were shipped from continent to continent to be enslaved. Forced to abandon their freedom, native cultures, and religions, Africans enslaved in America were forced to learn Christianity by white masters. By 1730 to 1740, quote, slaves began converting to Christianity with the First Great Awakening. Their traditional African religions and their gods began to blend with stories they were hearing from the Bible, unquote. Little did the enslavers know, their proselytizing would come back to bite them in the ass. While enslavers used the Bible to justify slavery, African Americans, quote, reinvented the religion that their masters thought would keep them subservient. That religion enabled them and their descendants to learn, to grow, to develop, to interpret, and reinvent the world in which they were trapped. While African Americans didn't believe in the white man's version of Christianity, they did believe in the religion itself. Christianity helped make sense of the senseless atrocities they faced and provided connection for their suffering. Although it might seem counterintuitive to believe in a religion that was used to justify their enslavement, it's important to remember that, quote, it isn't religion that keeps human beings enslaved, it's violence, unquote. After emancipation, African Americans understandably spent a lot of time in secular sanctuary spaces, leading to the Black church to become a cornerstone of and for Black culture. Quote, we do the church a great disservice if we fail to recognize that it was the first formalized site within African American culture, unquote. African Americans' faith only grew stronger with time, as Christianity in its various forms laid the foundation for Black culture in America. By the 1940s, white Americans noticed a religious and intellectual shift in Black culture, which had been apparent since the pre-abolition of slavery, but nonetheless, it was a shift new to them. It was a new basis on which to critique and find excuses for enslaving and segregating Black people in America. Or as Curtis J. Evans states in his book, The Burden of Black Religion, quote, the shift from a critique of Blacks' moral or religious life to their intellectual capabilities occurred in the post-World War I period, partially because of heightened attention to Black migration to the North, growing rates of education achievements for Blacks, and a newer respect and need for technical skills in an increasingly urban and industrialized society, end quote. Racists were trying everything to discredit Black intelligence and create a no-win situation for those they labeled inferior. Quote, the basis of Black inclusion and participation in the civic life of the nation changed, but the same conclusions were advanced, namely, that Blacks were unfit, morally at first and then intellectually, to enjoy basic rights as American citizens, unquote. But if there's one thing more powerful than American racist ideologies, it's American war propaganda. In the early years of the Roosevelt administration, quote, federal government agencies were in part responsible for proclamating the visual image of a monolithically folk African American Christianity, unquote. Under this administration, quote, photographers working for the Farm Security Administration helped to construct a social portrait of the Black church through initiatives like the 1941 publication 12 Million Black Voices, A Folk History of the Negro in the United States, which captured images of urban and rural African American Christian churches, unquote. While this draw to attention on Black churches in 1941 might have played some role in humanizing Black people in America, under the ongoing Jim Crow era, there was still just that, Black people in America, not Americans. But in 1942, under Roosevelt's administration, Quote, the Office of War Information produced Negroes in the War, a propaganda publication encouraged African American support for the U.S. involvement in World War II, end quote. As the National Museum of African American History and Culture states, by word and picture it tells what Black people are doing in agriculture, industry, and the armed forces. What do they have to lose if the Axis wins? What do they have to gain by an American victory? Unquote. With the publication of this propaganda, it would take over 20 years for the United States to repeal Jim Crow-era laws and give Black Americans civil rights. By the 1960s, the landscape in bargaining for equal and civil rights had changed. Quote, despite the guarantees afforded by the 15th and 19th Amendments, the right to vote was still a distant dream for many African Americans in the post-World War II era, unquote. The spark for a civil rights movement first erupted in Black churches, which historically provided a secular sanctuary and center for community, strength, and faith, which, quote, put them as natural leaders in the fight for civil rights. Black church leaders provided venue, space, and hosted meetings, supported and attended rallies and marches, and provided the emotional, moral, and spiritual support for their congregations, end quote. With more churches joining the fight for civil rights, Black churches became the target for white supremacist terrorism. Over 30 Black churches in the South had been bombed. Quote, it was about terrorism coming at Black people as a whole. When the Black church at its best is the public face of the witness of love and justice, it will be targeted. That's a quote from American philosopher and activist Cornel West. And I want to point out part of his quote that stuck out to me. When the Black church at its best is the public face of the witness of love and justice, it will be targeted. This leads me to question, did the Black church choose to become the face of the civil rights movement, or were they forced to be the face of the movement because of the violence and terrorism they faced? The turning point for the civil rights movement in 1964 came a month after Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, when the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed and, quote, claimed the lives of 4 little girls attending Sunday school, unquote. After learning of the bombings, quote, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. sent a telegram to Alabama Governor George Wallace, a staunch and vocal segregationist, stating bluntly, the blood of our little children is on your hands, unquote. King also spoke with a eulogy for the victims of this bombing. Here's some of that quote. And so this afternoon, in a real sense, they have something to say to each of us in their death. They have something to say to every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. They say to each of us, Black and white alike, that we must substitute courage for caution. Their death says to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly for the realization of the American dream, unquote. With the tension of the civil rights movement surging, the bombing and murder of 4 innocent girls, this gained not only national attention but international attention to the terror that subjugated African Americans for centuries. With this attention and eyes on the movement, there is a nationwide call to put an end to segregation and the terror of white supremacy. By July 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, and, quote, in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, committed to safeguarding the sanctity of the vote for all Americans. In conclusion, white supremacists knew that the heart of the Black community lies within its churches. That's why they were targeted. These fascists knew that this kind of terrorism would put a dagger through the spirit of the oppressed. But like the enslavers of the 1800s, what these white supremacists didn't know is that you can put a dagger through the heart of the oppressed spirit, but you will only awaken and enrage your soul. Thank you.